Hey guys, welcome back to more Reddit HOA Karen stories. In today's RIpestories video, for 30 years my family let the HOA neighborhood use part of our shoreline out of kindness. But then, a ridiculous HOA president tried to force me to destroy my legally built boat dock. And they threatened me with foreclosure even though I am no HOA member. Let's dive right into the video. And the first one is a fantastic malicious compliance story that is titled HOA fined me for my boat dock, so I banned them from my shoreline. So I live on a very nice piece of lakefront property that has been in my family for like 3 generations. My grandpa originally bought the land when this entire area was nothing but unpaved country roads, thick woods, and family-owned farms. He built a modest, sturdy house right near the water and cleared out a beautiful section of the shoreline and constructed a wooden boat dock so he could spend his weekends fishing. Decades later, the city started expanding outwards and developers began buying up all the surrounding farmland to build upscale, high-density residential subdivisions. One of those massive developers bought the entire tract of land wrapping around our property and established a massive homeowner association. And what can I say, they tried everything they could to get my grandpa to sell our lot to them, or at the very least legally join the new association. They offered him cash sums that seemed ridiculous at the time, sent representatives to our door practically every week, and even tried to pressure him through local zoning channels, but my grandpa was incredibly stubborn and valued his privacy above everything else, so he flatly refused. Our lot was completely carved out of the subdivision plans, remaining an independent non-HOA island right in the middle of a sprawling neighborhood of hundreds of uniform houses. Because our property basically sits directly between the main loop of the neighborhood and the best deep water shoreline on this side of the lake, the developers ran into a major problem when trying to market their homes. Their designated community common area was located on a shallow, marshy inlet that was completely useless for launching boats or swimming, and to fix this issue and make their development more attractive to buyers, the original developers approached my grandpa with an offer. They asked if he would allow the neighborhood residents to walk across a specific gravel path on the outer edge of our shoreline property to reach a sandy beach area and a natural boat launch spot. My grandpa was a genuinely decent man who just wanted to maintain a peaceful, friendly relationship with the people who would be living around him, so he agreed to a land use arrangement. He signed a basic permission document with the original development company that allowed neighborhood residents to use that specific shoreline path for recreational access. Over the years, the homeowner association grew and the residents treated the area as their own private community asset. They eventually installed 2 large wooden benches, placed a wooden sign welcoming residents to the lake area, and even paid a landscaping crew to keep the weeds trimmed along the path. For nearly 30 years, this arrangement just worked perfectly fine. My parents took over the house and eventually it passed down to my wife and me. The older board members who managed the HOA knew the history of the neighborhood and understood where the property lines were and always made sure to respect our privacy and keep the area clean. Everything changed when a woman named Sophia was elected as the president of the HOA board. Sophia was a relatively new resident actually, who had moved in from a completely different region, and she was the type of person who desperately craved bureaucratic authority. She immediately set out to restructure the entire neighborhood, implementing strict new rules. She clearly viewed the entire geographic layout of the subdivision as her personal empire, and she didn't appreciate the fact that there was a single property right in the middle of the lakefront that she couldn't control. Around this time, our old family boat dock was in desperate need of replacement. The original wooden pilings that my grandpa had driven into the lake bed were now starting to rot, and the main deck boards were warping from decades of water exposure, and a severe winter storm had left the outer section tilting dangerously into the water. My wife and I decided that instead of just patching it up, we would completely tear it down and build a modern, structurally sound dock that would last for the next 50 years. And I did absolutely everything by the book. Because our property is outside the HOA, I did not need to consult any neighborhood committees, but I did have to deal with extensive local and state government bureaucracy. I spent months working with the county planning department, the local building inspectors, and the state environmental protection board to get every necessary permit. We had to submit detailed architectural drawings, environmental impact assessments regarding the lakebed, and other documents to ensure that we were not infringing on any public waters or neighboring boundaries. We paid thousands of dollars in municipal administrative fees and secured every single blue ink structural permit, and even hired a highly reputable licensed marine construction contractor to handle the installation, but the construction took about 3 weeks. The contractors used heavy machinery to pull out the old rotting wood, drove new steel-reinforced pilings deep into the lakebed, and installed a beautiful, durable composite deck complete with a modern, motorized boat lift. It was completely legal, fully permitted, and completely within our surveyed property lines. Just 4 days after the contractors finished the project and cleaned up the site, I walked out to my mailbox and found an official envelope inside. Inside was a formal notice with the name of the HOA. The document stated that I was in direct violation of the community architectural guidelines for installing an unapproved marine structure on a managed shoreline. The letter claimed that the design materials and placement of my new dock had not been reviewed or authorized by the association board. The notice ordered me to immediately cease all use of the dock and completely dismantle it within 14 calendar days. If I failed to comply, the notice stated that a recurring fine of $100 per day would be assessed against my property, and the association would pursue legal action to force the removal of the structure. I assumed that this was a simple administrative error, and I figured that Sophia and her new board members had just looked at a map of the lakefront and assumed every house in the area was part of the association, and then sent the notice without checking their own historical records. I wanted to resolve it quickly and politely, so I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting, which was held at the community center. And by the way, guys, as veterans of HOA stories, if an HOA sent you such a letter and basically started to harass you, how would you have reacted? Let me know what you would have done in the comments, and while you're at it, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already to not miss any daily uploads. When my wife and I arrived at the meeting, the room was filled with about 20 residents sitting in folding chairs, while Sophia sat at a long table at the front alongside 3 other board members, and when the floor opened up for resident comments, I stood up, walked to the front, and explained that I was the owner of the lakefront lot containing the new dock, and I reached into my folder and extended a set of property-related documents towards the table. I spoke. I think there's a misunderstanding here. My house is not part of your HOA, and our lot was completely excluded from the subdivision before it was even built. Sophia didn't even reach out to take the papers from my hand though. She just sat back in her chair, crossed her arms, and looked right at me. "It doesn't matter what your county paperwork says," Sophia replied. "Your property connects to our neighborhood loop road, and your shoreline sits directly next to our residential lots. That means your land falls under our community guidelines, and we won't allow rogue residents to ruin the uniform look of the lakefront." I held the documents up higher, gesturing to the property lines. "Look at the official county documents. My private property line goes straight into the water. You have absolutely no legal right to tell me what I can build on my own land." Sophia let out a short scoff and waved her hand dismissively. "The board has full authority to regulate anything that impacts this community's presentation. If that unapproved structure is not completely dismantled in 14 days, the fines will continue accumulating automatically." Realizing that further conversation would be completely useless here, I took my documents, walked out of the community center, and went straight home. The 14-day grace period passed without us touching a single board on our new dock. Exactly 1 day after the deadline, a second notice arrived in my mailbox stating that my property had been assessed an initial fine of $100 for non-compliance, and that an additional $100 would be added for every consecutive day the violation remained unresolved. A week later, another notice arrived informing me that my balance had reached $700. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived stating that my outstanding fines had surpassed a 4-figure sum, and that if the balance was not settled within 30 days, the association would initiate legal proceedings to place a formal lien against my property and begin foreclosure actions. That was the exact moment I realized I needed to stop treating this as a petty neighborhood dispute and bring in professional help. I spent the next afternoon researching local real estate attorneys and scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. My lawyer reviewed the documents right there in his office, nodding slowly as I explained the history of the neighborhood and Sophia's absolute refusal to look at my county permits. He told me that based on the deeds and the municipal boundaries, the association had absolutely zero legal standing to issue fines and let alone place a lien on an independent piece of property. However, to ensure that we had a completely airtight defense before launching a counter strategy, he told me he wanted to conduct a thorough title search and archive review at the county records office to see exactly how the neighborhood subdivision was originally created. A few days later, my lawyer called my phone and asked me to come back to his office. He pulled out a document from a folder and laid it out between us. It was the original land use agreement that my grandfather had signed with the residential development company decades ago, and my lawyer explained that Sophia's aggressive push to find me had actually been the biggest mistake she could have made because it forced us to dig up the original legal foundation of the neighborhood's lake access, and he pointed to a specific clause in the middle of the old document. He explained that the agreement was not a permanent easement per tenant that attached to the land forever. Instead, the original lawyers had drafted it as a revocable personal license for land use. The text explicitly stated that the owner of our specific parcel granted the development company and its subsequent residents temporary permission to utilize the shoreline path for recreational water access, but that this permission could be completely revoked at any time for any reason solely at the discretion of the property owner by providing a standard written notice to the association. My lawyer told me that by issuing illegal fines against my property and claiming the association held jurisdiction over my shoreline, Sophia had fundamentally violated the underlying terms of mutual respect and recognition that the license was based upon. He looked at me and asked what I wanted to do next. I smiled and told him that if Sophia wanted to claim total control over the shoreline and refused to recognize my private property rights, I was more than happy to show her exactly what actual property ownership looked like. I told him I wanted to revoke their access completely and permanently. My lawyer spent the next hour drafting an incredibly precise, legally devastating formal letter addressed directly to Sophia and the Homeowner Association Board. The letter stated that due to the association's ongoing harassment, illegal attempts to assess fines against a non-member property, and fraudulent threats to place a lien on an independent estate, the property owner was officially executing the revocation clause found in the original land use agreement, and the notice stated that the temporary license allowing neighborhood residents to cross our land was formally terminated, effective 48 hours from the receipt of the delivery. The letter also noted that the association had exactly 48 hours to remove any encroaching community structures, including benches and signage, from our private land, or else they would be treated as abandoned property and disposed of accordingly. My wife and I did not waste a single moment of that 48-hour window. I immediately called a local commercial fencing company that I had vetted earlier in the week already. I explained the situation to the owner, paid a premium rush fee to secure a crew for Saturday morning, and provided them with the certified county survey maps showing our exact property boundaries. So then, early Saturday morning, the crew got out and immediately began unloading heavy metal fence posts, industrial tools, and rods of high-quality, vinyl-coated chain-link fencing. Before they started digging, I walked down to the shoreline path myself with a toolbox and a crowbar. I went over to the two large wooden benches that the association had installed on our grassy bank years ago, and I carefully unscrewed the mounting hardware, anchoring them to the ground, lifted them up and carried them across the line, placing them neatly on the association side of the boundary, and I did the exact same thing with their wooden welcome sign, pulling it out of the ground without damaging the structure and leaning it against one of the benches. I made absolutely sure not to damage any of their items, as I wanted to ensure they had no basis to claim I had destroyed HOA property or something, and the crew worked fast, focusing on the main bottleneck first. Soon they had successfully anchored the primary posts and stretched the heavy wire across the main entrance of the path, effectively sealing off the barrier while they moved down the line to finish the rest of the perimeter stretch. The gravel path that hundreds of residents had used for decades to reach the lake was now completely blocked at the street level by a solid, unyielding metal barrier. The timing couldn't have been more devastating for the neighborhood. It just so happened that the next weekend was the association's annual Lake Day celebration. This was traditionally the biggest community event of the entire summer. The board usually spent months planning it, organizing catered food trucks, setting up inflatable water slides on the neighborhood common grass, and inviting residents to bring their speedboats, jet skis, and kayaks down to our shoreline to launch them for a massive weekend-long beach party. I was sitting on my newly rebuilt back porch with my wife watching the road. And within minutes, a resident from down the street came driving down the loop road, towing a large pontoon boat behind his pickup truck. He swung the truck wide to the back, trailer down towards the shoreline path, only to then slam on his brakes as his headlights illuminated the brand new 6-foot-high metal fence, completely blocking the entrance. The man got out of his truck, looking completely bewildered. He walked up to the fence, grabbed the metal links with both hands and shook them as if trying to verify that the barrier was actually real. Within 15 minutes, 3 more cars pulled up behind his truck, creating a mini traffic jam on the neighborhood road. Residents got out of their vehicles carrying coolers, towing trailers loaded with jet skis, and carrying life jackets, and all of them gathering around the fence in a state of absolute confusion and growing anger. Word of the barrier spread through the subdivision incredibly fast, and within an hour, a crowd of about 40 neighbors had gathered along the edge of the fence line. Some of them were pointing at our house, others were arguing loudly with one another, and many of them were frantically pulling out their phones to call other board members. Through the front window of our living room, I watched as Sophia's car came speeding down the road and parked crookedly on the curb near the fence. She flung her door open and marched towards the metal barrier, her face completely flushed with anger. She stood at the fence line looking at the benches and the sign that I'd neatly deposited on her side of the boundary, and then she looked up towards our house. She marched right up our driveway, stomped onto our front porch, and began pounding on our wooden front door. I waited a few seconds, opened the door just a few inches, and then looked out at her. Sophia glared at me, her chest heaving as she pointed down towards the road. "What do you think you're doing with this fence? You're completely ruining a sanctioned community event, causing a massive public disturbance and illegally blocking a public lake. The board is gonna sue you for every single dime of lost revenue." I kept my hands in my pockets and remained completely calm. "You need to step off my porch and lower your voice. My lawyer sent your board a formal legal notice. Because of your fake fines and harassment, we officially revoked the neighborhood's temporary license to cross our land. You cannot just undo 30 years of community access over a minor disagreement," Sophia yelled, stepping closer to the screen door. "That path belongs to the neighborhood, and I will have the county sheriff down here with bolt cutters before noon to take this garbage down." "The fence is entirely on my private property and it's staying up permanently," I replied. "Also, the sheriff is not gonna touch it because I have the blueprints and the county survey right here. Now, if you don't turn around and leave my property right this second, I'm calling the cops to have you cited for criminal trespass." Sophia opened her mouth to keep arguing, but she saw me pull my phone out of my pocket and she bit her lip, spun around on her heel, and stormed down our porch steps. She walked back to the crowd of furious neighbors who were waiting for her by the fence. From what I could see through the window, she spent the next 20 minutes basically trying to calm the crowd down, waving her hands wildly before everyone eventually packed up their coolers and trailers and left the area. The cancellation of Lake Day was only the very beginning of the chaos that Sophia's actions caused for the subdivision. The immediate physical reality of losing the shoreline path created a massive logistical nightmare for every single boat owner in the neighborhood. Because the association's own designated common area was a shallow, muddy swamp, residents could no longer launch their watercraft anywhere within the boundaries of their community. If a resident wanted to take their boat out on the water, they now had to hitch their trailer up to their vehicle, drive out of the subdivision, and travel 3 miles down a winding, narrow county highway to a public municipal boat ramp, pay a $15 daily launch fee, and wait in long lines with the general public. What used to be a 5-minute walk down the street had turned into a multi-hour chore. The real financial devastation, however, hit the local real estate market. At any given time, there were usually about 10 to 15 homes listed for sale within the upscale subdivision. Because the neighborhood had enjoyed water access for 3 decades, every single real estate agent in the county prominently featured private neighborhood lake access as one of the primary selling points for the community, and by Monday morning, the listing agents were frantically calling their clients. The title companies and real estate brokerages realized that the advertised private lake access no longer existed. Every single active listing in the neighborhood had to be immediately updated to remove any mention of private beach or boat launch privileges. Multiple buyers who were currently under contract to purchase homes in the subdivision officially backed out of their deals during the contingency period, citing the sudden loss of a major community amenity. The neighborhood property values were basically facing an immediate quantifiable decline, and the residents knew exactly who was to blame. By the time Tuesday evening arrived, the anger in the community had reached an absolute boiling point. An emergency homeowner association meeting was called to address the lake access crisis. The board usually held their meetings in a small side room at the community center, but because the turnout was expected to be massive, they had to open up the main gymnasium. My wife and I decided to walk down the street and attend the meeting as observers, since we wanted to see exactly how the bureaucratic structure would collapse. When we walked into the gymnasium, the room was packed to the gills. Over 100 residents were sitting in the bleachers and folding chairs, and the atmosphere was tense. Sophia sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking visibly exhausted and stressed, but she was still trying to maintain her rigid, authoritative posture. Sitting directly next to her was an older guy in a sharp suit who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. This was the HOA's staff attorney, the guy who actually handled the neighborhood's legal filings and insurance contracts. The meeting skipped the standard administrative readings and went immediately into the floor discussion. A large angry man who lived a few houses down from me stood up and demanded to know why the board had allowed the lake access to be cut off and what specific legal actions were being taken to tear down my fence. Sophia took the microphone and tried to regain control of the room. She stated the board was working diligently to handle the situation. She claimed that I was a rogue property owner who was acting in complete violation of community standards, and she assured the audience that their legal counsel was currently preparing a formal lawsuit to secure an emergency injunction that would force the removal of the fence. As soon as she finished speaking, the HOA's attorney, who also lived in the HOA, reached over, took the microphone out of her hand, and stood up. He adjusted his glasses, looked out at the crowded room, and delivered a speech that completely dismantled Sophia's entire presidency. The attorney bluntly told the crowd that there would be no lawsuit, no injunction, and no forced removal of the fence. He explained that after receiving the certified letter from my lawyer, he had spent a lot of time thoroughly reviewing all documents. He stated in no uncertain terms that my property was completely independent of the homeowner association and always had been, and he explained that the board had absolutely zero legal right, jurisdiction, or authority to issue architectural violations or assess fines against my land. The room went completely silent as the attorney dropped the real bombshell. He explained the neighborhood's entire history of lake access relied completely on a temporary land use license signed by my grandfather. He turned around, looked directly at Sophia, and stated that by illegally harassing me, ignoring my valid county permits, and sending fraudulent threats of property foreclosure over a completely legal boat dock, Sophia had committed a massive breach of administrative duty, and he informed the entire room that her actions had legally triggered the revocation clause of the license, causing the neighborhood to permanently lose its access to the shoreline. He concluded by telling the residents that from a legal standpoint, the fence was completely valid, entirely situated on private land, and the association had absolutely no recourse to force it down. The vice president of the association board, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and had always been friendly with my family, stood up and took the microphone. He looked at Sophia and stated that her aggressive, short-sighted behavior had created an absolute disaster for every single homeowner in the subdivision, and he immediately called for an emergency vote of no confidence to remove Sophia from her position as president and strip her of her seat on the board. And what can I say? They actually successfully removed her in no time. The next afternoon, my wife and I were sitting on our front porch when we saw 3 people walking up our driveway. It was the newly appointed acting president of the association along with the vice president and one of the older community members. They walked up the porch steps slowly, looking incredibly humble and apologetic. The acting president looked at me and said that they wanted to formally apologize on behalf of the entire neighborhood for the way Sophia had treated us. He handed me a folder containing an official document signed by the remaining board members stating that all previous violation notices, fines, and legal threats against my property were completely cancelled, nullified, and removed from their tracking systems. He then asked if we could sit down and discuss a potential resolution to reopen the shoreline path, and I listened to him quietly, took the folder containing the fine cancellation notice, and placed it on the table next to my chair. I looked at the 3 board members and told them that while I appreciated their apology and the speed with which they had handled Sophia, the answer was no. I explained to them that for 30 years, my family had generously allowed the neighborhood to use our private land out of simple neighborly goodwill without ever asking for a single dime in return. However, Sophia's actions had shown us exactly how fragile our privacy and peace of mind were when dealing with an entitled power-tripping board, so I told them that the experience of having people threaten our home over a legally permitted project had completely changed our perspective. Furthermore, I told them that after spending a week with the fence up, my wife and I had realized just how much we actually enjoyed having our entire shoreline completely to ourselves without hundreds of strangers walking past our house every weekend. I told them that the fence was staying up permanently and the shoreline path was closed for good. They looked incredibly defeated, but they knew they had absolutely no leverage anymore. They thanked me for my time and walked back down the driveway and then left. And yeah guys, if you ask me, this is exactly why homeowner associations are a cancer on American suburbs. They can attract the absolute worst kind of people, usually bored out of touch with reality narcissists who want to play dictator because they have zero control over any other aspect of their lives. But honestly, in this story at least, the real losers are the people who bought houses in that subdivision over the last 5 years. I mean, imagine paying a premium for a house because the Zillow listing promised private neighborhood-like access, only to find out that your access depended entirely on the vibes of a guy living in an independent cabin next door. And a Reddit user in the comments said, "You handled this terribly. You literally say that you had a choice to walk away, but you stayed and poked the bear. What did you think was gonna happen? You cannot play with fire and then complain about getting burned. They suck for obvious reasons, but you also suck for dragging everyone down with you when you clearly had an out. You made your bed and now lie in it." And then a user in the comments responded to that comment by saying, "I'm honestly baffled by the YTA votes here. Are we reading the same post?" OP was literally backed into a corner by people actively trying to ruin his life. You don't just walk away from a coordinated effort to destroy your reputation. OP did what anyone with a spine would do and refused to be a doormat. The fact that things got messy don't make you an a-hole, it makes you human. Stand your ground, OP. And the next one is a funny story from r/MaliciousCompliance and is titled His Raw Burger. So years ago, a friend had people over for a pool party. I offered to help cook the burgers and hot dogs on the grill, and people ate faster than I could even cook. I probably started later than I should have, so there were a few people who were just waiting for their burgers. A guy I will call Jay asked for a burger, and based on the people who were waiting, the one he was going to get had just hit the grill a minute before, but Jay was hungry and hangry and began insisting that I give him his burger now. So I did, and the burger he was gonna get was placed on his buns. He was mad, but he did not have many options, so he asked if I could cook it first, and I agreed. He was much more polite the second time. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I guess you could say it's rare that a man will admit he was wrong. Anyway, thank you for watching, I hope you have an awesome day, and I will see you again tomorrow.